Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens. In today's episode, we'll be turning our attention to Japan. After 8 years, Japan elected a new Prime Minister, Suga Yoshihide, on 14 September 2020, with 70% of the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, vote. Since then, Suga's government continues to face a challenging internal and external environment. The LDP suffered a blow in by-elections in the end of April 2021 and faces public discontent with the government's handling of COVID and other domestic political scandals. And in just 3 months' time, the 2020 Olympics and Paralympic Games are due to be held in Tokyo amid a targeted state of emergency. Internationally, Prime Minister Suga was quick to establish a strong start to the US-Japan relationship under Biden, looking to the US as well as to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, for coordination on common security, economic, and humanitarian challenges. So joining me today are two of my colleagues from the IISS Japan Chair program based in London to discuss these issues further. Robert Ward is the Director of Geo-economics and Strategy and the IISS Japan Chair. Yuka Koshino is the Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy, and her research focuses on Japan's foreign relations, security and defense policy, and economic statecraft. So welcome back to the podcast, Yuka and Robert.
Thank you very much for having us again.
Thank you, Meia. Thanks for having us.
So, Robert, let's start with you. As mentioned, Prime Minister Suga faces quite a challenging start to his administration. Can you unpack the domestic political environment that's facing the Prime Minister for us a little bit?
So as you said at the beginning, Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide, when he took office in September last year, even then the year ahead was going to be difficult for him. There was some speculation that he would call an early general election very soon into his administration, but he didn't, which then raised the premium on everything going right for him in the coming months. Unfortunately, things haven't really panned out domestically as he perhaps would have hoped. And there are now four main challenges for him as he moves to the two deadlines in his premiership in the short term, which is the LDP presidential election and the next general election. So these four challenges are, the first obviously is COVID. As it is for any leader anywhere at the moment. And Japan's vaccine rollout has been slow for reasons which I'm sure we'll talk about in the coming questions. So that's been slow. The impact of the recent state of emergency that has been declared in key economic areas of Japan, including Tokyo and Osaka, they will have an impact on the economy. So the Prime Minister is dealing with the COVID crisis. On top of that, he has the Olympics to think about. The plans are at the moment, as of this podcast, that the Olympics are going to go ahead, possibly with spectators, although the spectators wouldn't be allowed to do any cheering, which is going to be quite a lot of exercise in self-restraint, I think, for any spectators, if they're allowed in, or perhaps without spectators. So that is also a logistical headache for the Prime Minister. And then, as I said, the last two challenges, his term as LDP leader, and by tradition as Prime Minister, runs out in September this year. He's continuing the last year of Abe Shinzo's LDP leadership term. He's going to have to fight that. And of course, on top of that, as I've already said, he's got the next general election to fight, and that has to be held by the end of October. So a really packed domestic schedule, both politically, logistically, economically, pretty much in every single respect for the Prime Minister.
So let's unpack some of those challenges and how the Prime Minister is responding to them. You mentioned the slow rollout of the vaccine in Japan. Why is the rollout so slow?
There are a number of reasons for that. And I think at the moment, Japan's got one of the lowest vaccinated population percentages in the rich world. But as I said, there are a number of reasons for this. Partly logistical, for example, a shortage of manpower, personnel to deliver the vaccines. But also, I think, a sort of deeper structural problem for Japan, which I'm sure policymakers will be looking at very closely going forward, is Japan's lack of domestic vaccine producing capacity. So it is depending on vaccines, largely from Pfizer at the moment, coming into the country. And of course, that makes it vulnerable to supply issues, various logistical issues outside Japan. So those are a couple of the reasons. But clearly, for the vaccine rollout, the success of this is also important. Is also related to the success of the Olympics. Logistically, a lot of athletes coming into Japan from outside. The government will be keen to get as many of the vulnerable people in Japan vaccinated ahead of this.
And let's talk about some of the other structural challenges that the administration is seeking to address. We know that there's a heavy economic agenda on the table as well, including a digitalization policy, setting goals for curbing carbon emissions and others. What progress has been made on these issues, and what are some of the remaining challenges here?
The Suga administration started off with its signature trumpet call, if you like, as about to be all about economics, all about raising productivity, all about cutting the barriers to growth that are in Japan, and the platform of the administration's economic push made absolute sense given the issues that are in Japan. And it made a good start, notwithstanding the COVID environment. The Hanko Wars, those of you that follow Japan will be aware of the Hanko Wars. So in Japan, a lot of the procedures in bureaucracy and business, they need a physical stamp. Now, these things are incredibly beautifully made, great works of art, each stamp. But they do take a lot of time, and each stamp has to be stamped physically. So you can imagine what that does to productivity in terms of throughput of decisions, for example. The administrative reform minister, Kono Taro, he started off with a big splash with his Hanko Wars to try and get rid of these stamps, to streamline procedures. And at the beginning of the year, there was talk of him getting rid of about 15,000 procedures that needed a Hanko stamp. So these Hankos just give you the idea of just how prevalent these stamps are. So this had a lot of political theatre about it, but the actually physically very important to make sure that as I said, procedures are streamlined, that things move through the system more quickly. That was a sort of piece of theatre, but also important. But the really key bit of the Suga economic push, in our view, was his wish to set up a digital agency to coordinate, a sort of control tower for Japan's digital policy. And as we know, going forward, all the economics is all going to be about digitalization and strategy and policy around that. The issue, this digital agency will be set up towards the end of the year, so it's all sort of moving forward. I think the issue about this agency, however, is will it be largely operational? So will it be tasked with digitalizing Japan's legacy systems? Japan's one of the few countries where you can still use a fax machine, for example. So to give you an idea of just how urgently this digitalization is needed, or will it, as we hope it will be, become more of an organization thinking about Japan's digitalization more strategically?
Actually, that's a very important point that Robert made in terms of how to operationalize the digital agency versus how to think more strategically. And in that sense, I think Japan's digital policy and innovation policy in general should probably need a more long-term strategy to invest in human talent, deal with these digital demands in the government, but also to create an environment, especially more of a financing or funding mechanism, to allow the researchers to focus and take risks on basic R&D in critical and emerging technologies to boost Japan's future economic competitiveness.
In addition to, of course, the very important digital agenda that you just mentioned, COVID has, of course, also exacerbated a debt problem in Japan. And public debt, as far as I understand, stands at more than twice the size of Japan's economy. So what fiscal and structural reforms is Prime Minister Suga pursuing to address this?
Well, Japan's debt burden was even before the COVID crisis enormous, the largest in the rich world. The debt, as all the COVID, a mixture between the need for fiscal support for the economy against COVID, coupled with the recession that Japan's had, will leave Japan with a debt to GDP, a gross debt to GDP burden of about 250 to 260%. That is enormous, far bigger than Italy, which is also has very weak public finances. It's not going to. There's no risk of a crisis at the moment because interest rates are so incredibly low, and the markets have a trust, I think, in the Japanese government that if they need to, they can take measures to improve the public finances by, for example, raising taxes and so on. So it is stable, but of course, with a debt stock that large, it does. Just sustaining it and thinking about it does drain bandwidth from any government. So that's one legacy. In terms of the economic prospects, Japan's had a pretty rough ride last year, and as I noted earlier, with the emergency the state of emergency that's been declared in key areas, that will hit growth, particularly in the second term. So in terms of the growth prospects going forward, the Biden fiscal stimulus, which is absolutely enormous, I mean, absolutely huge, that will wash out of the US as well and benefit exporters such as Japan, China, Germany, and others. So that will also help to boost Japan's short-term growth prospects towards the end of this year and into next year. And of course, China, Japan's absolutely key market, is growing pretty strongly, partly, of course, due to stimulus there as well. But once the froth of the stimulus measures externally has ebbed, Japan's growth trajectory will settle down into quite a sort of unexciting, probably around 1%, 1.5% if it's lucky. So Japan won't be able to grow out of the won't be able to rehabilitate its public finances by having rapid growth. So that will be one constraint. The other constraint, of course, over the short term is that COVID is draining the bandwidth from the government. So as governments everywhere, our Japanese government is also, it wants to do its structural reforms, it wants to do other reforms, but of course COVID is taking all the bandwidth from policy thinking at the moment, unfortunately.
But has COVID also perhaps served as a catalyst for Japan's structural reforms or thinking on economic resilience? Now, Yuka, this is something that you look at quite closely as well.
Yes, COVID-19 really made the already existing issues of economic resilience that Japan had to think about, especially in the context of US-China technology competition and potential decoupling, and gave a more sense of urgency to this Japan's effort, including, I think, in the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, when it spread it to US and Europe, Japan launched this supplemental budget, which included supply chain diversification. And there were some announcements recently made about the allocations and potential new budgets for it. But a lot of the media reporting, for instance, described Japan as thinking ahead. But what essentially happened was that Japan was already thinking about how to strategically shift production or bring back some production back to Japan or shift some production out from China to ASEAN countries to deal with these more strategic challenges. So that's one example. I think another example for Japan's kind of the impact of COVID-19 on Japan's thinking on economic resiliency and challenges is really that COVID-19 revealed that Japan probably lacked pandemic response in Japan's thinking on economic resilience or economic security issues. After the pandemic, not because of pandemic, but Japan also established the Economic Security Division within the National Security Secretariat, which is the administrative body of the National Security Council. Their primary response was to deal with the security challenges or strategic infrastructure investments or how to deal with China's civil fusion, for instance. But what they actually ended up using most of their time was how to deal with the economic challenges in COVID-19. But that also reveals that Japan is now starting to think about pandemic more from a national security point of view, and probably there might be some future discussions about how to strategically invest in national vaccine development for future pandemic responses. So the structure of this economic vision and national security secretariat came at the right time. It's just that there's probably much more work that the organization needs to think about as they continue to respond with the pandemic.
So, Robert, considering all of these different initiatives that are currently taking place in short succession and the start of Prime Minister Suga's administration, how likely do you think he is to win the LDP leadership bid later this year, as well as the general election?
Well, this is the big question that will be exercising the Prime Minister at the moment. I don't think he's going to have an early general election. That just doesn't seem to be his style. I think he's going to try and concentrate on the key things that he needs to domestically, certainly, which would be the COVID crisis, as I mentioned earlier, and also the Olympics. So I think those are going to be the things he's going to focus on at home. His popularity was very, very high when he took office. In part, that was so a bit of euphoria amongst voters after 8 years of Abe. So he was wasn't a new face, but he was certainly new in that particular role. So he's a sort of different type of politician as well. He's not one of the political aristocracy that pepper Japan's political scene. He comes from far more humble background. So he's got an interesting backstory, and that played well initially. However, there have been a few policy missteps, and of course, COVID fatigue in Japan as well, and then the uncertainty over the Olympics. The Olympics are not necessarily popular throughout Japan, holding them. Some people don't want the Olympics to happen. And this has all caused Suga to lose a bit of political altitude over the past few months. So I think he'll leave the general election, calling the general election, which is in his gift. I think he'll leave that as long as he can, which means towards September or even potentially into October. But of course, this is also a risk for him because in Japan, generally, elections are held well before the end of a parliament's term. This would be different from that. So this would be right at the end of the parliament's term. And of course, again, the closer you get to the end date of this parliament, the less room there is for manoeuvre. There's been some opinion polls out recently which have shown other people in the LDP more popular than him. Kono Taro is one of the most popular, comes out top. Even Abe Shinzo, the previous prime minister, is in the list of those that some of the public want to see as prime minister again. So there's a bit of a debate in Japan over whether Abe is going to make another comeback. I suspect not, actually, because things have moved on, but never say never in Japanese politics.
Fascinating. Yuka, let's turn to Japan's foreign and security policy. What are Prime Minister Suga's priorities and how do they differ from those of the Abe administration? Are we just seeing more of the same when it comes to, in particular, US-Japan relations, or are there new things on the horizon?
Prime Minister Suga came into office with a clear message that his intention is to continue what Prime Minister Abe has started to do, which is to promote the vision of free and open Indo-Pacific. So just for some of the listeners who have not been following the diplomatic strategy on Japan, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which often referred to as Voip, has three stated goals. It's essentially Japan's diplomatic strategy, which was launched in 2016 by Prime Minister Abe. First, to maintain the rules-based order and transparency in governance. Second, to promote economic connectivity across the region. And three, to promote and maintain security. But there are also unstated three strategic goals that I've observed behind this construct, which is very important to discuss about Prime Minister Suga's diplomacy. One, to maintain the rules-based order at a time of U.S. leadership vacuum in the region, especially during the presidential transition last year. And second, really to include India to the table to discuss about regional economic and political and security order. And third, to keep the U.S. glued to the regional economic and political regional construct. So in that sense, I think we've heard a lot of experts and critiques about Japan's Voip being vague, but it's vague intentionally, and there are some tangible results that I will refer to later. But if you look at these three unstated strategic goals, despite the fact that Prime Minister Suga came into office focusing more on the economic agenda, we can see that he has maintained and achieved these three goals.
That's fascinating. Yuka, could you also explain how the US administration's Asia policy impacts Voip?
So far, I think I've seen two major observations about US Asia policy and its impact on Japan's thinking. One is that there's a lot of continuity from the Trump administration, which also reflects this traditional bipartisan support on Asia policy and on how to deal with China. So one for Japan, the very big part was the China policy. Japan was initially concerned if it was going back to the second administration of the Obama administration, where the US and China, for instance, agreed on forming a new model of great power relationship. But the Biden administration continued to maintain a tough stance on China. And also the technology competition part was also remained as one of the central front for the competition with China. As a result, many of the initiatives advanced under the Trump administration in the context of US-Japan cooperation has continued. One of the major achievements in the economic connectivity was really the physical and digital infrastructure cooperation between US and Japan. This has various aspects, including cooperation between the public and private financing institutions to, for instance, finance Palau's undersea cables with Australia, but also to coordinate to create a more diversified and innovative telecom supply chains. And at the summit, we've seen that it was the first time for the announcement between the leaders level to jointly promote Open RAN 5G, which is a more diversified and disaggregated network as a kind of alternative to the existing Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia's single kind of provided network. And also another big news was that the two sides also committed at the summit to fund 4.5 billion US dollars for 5G and beyond technologies. So these are something that's a continuation of the work from the Trump administration, which has made some progress under the Biden administration as well. The second would be probably the differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, but is really the centrality of the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad mechanism in U.S. thinking of the regional economic, political, and security architecture. So we've seen that the Quad is not just a security dialogue, but it has expanded to include topics like climate change, technology standards settings, and also on how to deal with the COVID-19 challenges. And it also has a lot of discussions around how to create a more resilient supply chain. And also just thinking about the size of the Quad countries, you can see that the role of the Quad in regional order is going to be significant. We have the first and the third and the fourth largest economies in the world. So I guess that will be a little bit, so probably in terms of how it's relevant to Voip, in terms of US-Japan cooperation, probably the Quad will be the center of cooperation in the region, and there might be some opportunities for other interested parties like for instance UK or Europe to potentially engage with the Quad.
So you mentioned the topics of economic resilience and the challenges that China poses to truly secure supply chains for Japan. I'd like to touch on that a little bit more. Japan is currently, as you said, pursuing a number of initiatives to, particularly in technology, to diversify its supply chains, to divest away from China. I know that this is one of your primary areas of research, so you'd be best placed to tell us, where do decoupling efforts in Japan actually stand today practically? What have been the real results of this?
That's a very difficult question, actually, because the government and the companies are still in the middle of struggling. And I think it also will really depend on to what extent the US administration, now because the Biden administration is more willing to work with allies and partners rather than the previous Trump administration's approach to unilaterally kind of put sanctions on certain companies and countries. It's actually good, but also gives a lot of pressure for Japan as well as an US ally on to what extent it could decouple, especially on critical technology areas like semiconductors, AI, or telecommunications. And we have already seen in the past, even just the past several weeks, that even when Japan has started to think about how to strengthen its economic security, including the recent strengthening of the foreign investment screening. There are, like any other countries, loopholes, and there are still, some Japanese important technology companies, which is working with the U.S. Technology companies as well, have been receiving Chinese investments. That is just one example, but I think what makes Japan's thinking on decoupling or diversifying supply chain is the Japanese government or the companies itself is not necessarily aware of how much they are entangled in the global supply chain and how it's very, very, very difficult to decouple with China. And I'm sure Robert would like to add to my comments as well.
Absolutely spot on point from Yuka. It's very difficult to decouple from China. I mean, there will be selective decoupling, yes, in certain strategic industries, but Japan is a good example of just how difficult that is to pull off in practice. So the government is giving subsidies to companies to move some production out of China, but it's interesting just how few companies have taken that up. Because, of course, the fact is that China is Japan's most important market and is vital for the health of the Japanese economy. So I think to all those that are sort of advocating full decoupling, Japan is a good example of just how difficult that is to do, and how any policy towards China also has to calibrate that market reliance into it.
Absolutely. I think that we're seeing that in Europe as well, and not least in Taiwan. Yuka.
Just maybe expanding a little more about what I mentioned by how the U.S. administration's approach on supply chain diversity gives a little bit of a pressure on Japan. I think I wanted to expand a little more on that. Because the United States is not necessarily integrated in the regional economic architecture, such as after the withdrawal from CPTPP in 2017, the United States is also not part of the recently concluded RCEP agreement, which was led by China. But Japan is in both agreements, and it is more in a position to kickstart the conversation and to really work with regional partners, including ASEAN, to think about how to create a resilient supply chain. So the United States, in a way, has to rely on Japan on that front. So in that sense, there's a pressure on Japan. And although that Japan is seen as a country where the government and the industries are much closer, and of course, LDP's space is the one of the largest space is the Business Federation. But at the same time, as we have discussed, Japanese companies are still struggling to really shift their production line out from China. So that'll be a big challenge that Japan will face.
I quickly tried to get Taiwan into the conversation just now, and I'm going to return back to it because a very important meeting took place, of course, between Japan and the United States, a 2+2 meeting of US and Japanese foreign and defense ministers recently, in which the US and Japan publicly agreed to jointly oppose Chinese coercion in the region. This was, I think, by some analysts and observers, interpreted as a statement directed at a Taiwan scenario and Japan's participation in support of the US in such a scenario. How should we interpret this statement in practice, Yuka?
So at this point, I think it's a little bit too early to discuss about what specifically that Japan and the United States could do in times of Taiwan contingency. At the same time, I would also highlight the importance of the recent, not just a 2+2, but there was a mention of underscoring the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits in the joint statement made by the US and Japan during the recent summit. This is very significant because the last time that the Taiwan Straits was mentioned was back in 1969 when there was a Nixon and President Nixon and Prime Minister Sato met. But that was very different context because it was before the Japan-China normalization. So the fact that there was a mention about Taiwan after normalization is very significant. But at the same time, as you mentioned, the 2+2 meetings and the phrasings and the word used in the joint statement actually did create some room for Japan and the United States to start thinking and discuss about how to jointly respond and operate in times of contingency, which is also a big step, I think, for U.S. and Japan. So it's too early to assess whether they have started or not, but it actually does create room for discussion.
Robert.
Just to continue on what Yuka was saying, it's extraordinary. When Suga took office last year, everybody said, well, he won't be a foreign policy prime minister. He'll focus on the domestic economy and the issues we've talked about. But actually, just shows how events can change things. The prime minister, I would argue, has had his greatest successes, some of his greatest successes so far in his brief term in foreign policy. You look at the momentum that the Quad has gained since he's been in office, the meetings that he's had there. If you look at the Biden administration, the Biden summit, and as Yuka has been talking about, the Taiwan statement, I mean, these are all pretty big things. So there's really successes that Suga's had on foreign policy, I think, are already noteworthy in a very brief period. But also, I think Suga is building on the legacy, Abe Shinzo's foreign policy legacy, and sort of taking it forward. Some of the things that Suga has been doing, I don't think would have been possible had not Abe had, in his 8 years, put lots of interesting changes in place institutionally and in terms of how Japan conceptualizes foreign policy too.
We've talked about these successes, but of course, in contradiction to the successes, there's the Japan relationship with South Korea, which hasn't developed very positively in recent months. So in that sense, where does mending bilateral relations with the Moon Jae-in administration stand in Suga's list of foreign policy priorities? And how important is that to Japan's overall security agenda at the moment?
Yes, I think there are rooms for trilateral cooperation. First is that North Korean nuclear and missile threats has always been the major factor for bringing together South Korea and Japan on the table and to foster trilateral cooperation. We've seen continuous challenges in nuclear on the ballistic missile security front from North Korea. And also adding that the Biden administration has expressed interest in working together trilaterally on these North Korean issues. And we've also recently seen the national security advisors from the three countries discuss about these challenges. So there are signs of potential room for trilateral cooperation. And I think that's a very important top area to watch going ahead.
So, Yuka and Robert, we have run out of time for this episode, but before we sign off, I'd like to ask each of you for 60-second bursts of what you'll be watching for in your respective areas of research regarding Japan. Robert, you first.
Clearly, we're going to be looking at defense and military developments in Japan. Very important, and lots going on there, particularly around cyber technology, as Yuka has been talking about, and the grey zone threat from China, how Japan responds to that. Specifically, I think there's a big question around how Japan builds resilience, economic resilience, political resilience, perhaps even, while being China's neighbor. So we talked about supply chains and so on. I think there's lots of thinking to be done around Japan and economic resilience.
Yuka?
I think, as I mentioned, I'm very interested in continuing to follow how the Quad is going to develop and how potential regional or external actors like the United Kingdom, which has launched its Indo-Pacific tilt strategy, start to engage with the Quad or the regional framework. Another area I would watch is that I've talked a lot about economic resilience and more on the defensive side of economic security today, but there are discussions about how to foster R&D in AI, quantum computing, biotechnology in Japan, both from a strategic perspective, but for Japan's future economic competitiveness. And there's much discussions about how to develop a more kind of robust STEM, education in Japan, and how to make sure that Japan can have a system to invest in its human talent. So I would also be very interested in following Japan's innovation policy, and how these geopolitical environment will affect that as well.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to keeping up to date with both of your research areas and on those specific topics in the future. I'll thank you both now for coming on the show and offering such insightful comments on this topic and look forward to having you on the podcast again soon.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Meia.
And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. And for more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you and see you next time.